Focus for a second on the distinction between a great historian who is attentive to sociological processes or social processes. Mm-hmm. So that would be history with a sociological edge.
Yes.
How does that differentiate itself from historical sociology?
Well, in the best of all possible worlds, there will be no difference. And some of the greatest commentators on history and sociology, including the late British history sociologist Philip Abrams, in his book Historical Sociology, and others have pointed out, in the best of all possible worlds, there should be no difference. History should be theoretical. Sociology should be historical. There should be no difference. And this has led a number of people that are in the discipline of sociology to reject all out of hand the idea of a specific subfield or subdiscipline called historical sociology. And of course they're right, that in an ontological and epistemological sense, there should be no difference between these disciplines. Nonetheless, we live in a world of actually existing scientific and academic disciplines, and recognizing the structure and relation among the structure of those disciplines and the relations among disciplines is one of the things that sociologists are actually kind of good at, mm-hmm. because they've developed theories of the sociology of knowledge, of the sociology of intellectual knowledge, and of the sociology of science. And what we recognize there is that these disciplines, history and sociology, have very different histories, and we have to understand that contextually. So the discipline of history in the United States or the discipline of history in Germany came out of a very different genesis, had a very different genesis than the discipline of sociology. Just take the German case for one moment, since I was talking about that earlier. The discipline of history was quite well established in a way that along with philosophy, probably the queen of the disciplines in the 19th century in the German university. Mm-hmm. And the great historians were, in the sense that I've described, probably historicist. In fact, the notion of historicism grew up first to describe the work of these great German historians like Ranke and so on. But in their most prominent versions and most extreme versions, they were averse to systematic theorizing. Right. And this was one of the criticisms that Max Weber, for example, launched against the traditional historians. Even though he was trained by them, his first and his second dissertations were historical dissertations. The second one was a dissertation in Roman history written with one of the great German ancient historians. So Max Weber knew historians and knew historiography, but rejected the kind of tendency to make each individual historical case so specific that it was not amenable even to a generalizing of mechanisms across contexts. Mm-hmm. And the kind of historical sociology that I think both Chuck Tilley and myself and others are pushing toward nowadays in the U.S. is one that wants to combine the attentiveness to historical context, the uniqueness of the constellation and conjunction of different mechanisms, with systematic theorizing about those mechanisms. The mechanisms then become somewhat portable across contexts, although they may not be universally transportable. The mechanism, to take one example from the human sciences of the unconscious in Freudian and psychoanalytic theory, may be, perhaps, we don't know, perhaps applicable in this time, in this day and age, and maybe perhaps applicable across Western societies, but perhaps not in African societies, as some have argued, or pre-colonial societies. We don't know without systematic investigation. But that doesn't stop us from developing a theoretical project parallel to our historical project of systematic reflection on the nature of that causal mechanism or that causal structure, mm-hmm. the unconscious or social class or whatever the mechanism in question might be. And I think this is one of my few differences with the program that was spelled out by Chuck Tilley, as a matter of fact, in that I would see the work on the theorizing of those causal mechanisms as being equally fundamental for sociology as the work on the historical combination of those mechanisms in producing historical events and processes. And I think sociologists need to have a foot in both camps and need to be, if possible, involved in both. And the work on the theoretical work on the elaboration of the underlying structural mechanisms can have a relative autonomy, I think, from the historical research. I think it's okay in a discipline to have a division of labor to some extent between people who are primarily concerned with a more theoretical, philosophical approach to something like the mechanism of social class, the mechanism of the unconscious, the mechanism of symbolic capital, to use a term from Pierre Bourdieu, or the field in Bourdieu's terminology. And the people who do systematic historical research combining these mechanisms in different ways to explain and make sense of different sort of processes. But in the best of all possible worlds, sociology would combine both.
If you just took one mechanism that,
And that's, but by the way, that's I think that if there is a difference then to conclude in the real existing practices of historians and sociologists, I would say that sociologists, because they've traditionally in the United States and elsewhere had a more systematic commitment to the idea of theory as one aspect of the graduate student training and of the research, and of the more systematic use of theory and development of theory. I think that is, and most historians would agree, a difference between the two disciplines. Now, that doesn't mean that the disciplines sort of in the best of all possible worlds should differ in that way, but I think that is a difference in the training that the students actually get. The sociologists, by contrast, don't get the same sort of training that the historians get in historical ways of imagining the combinations of mechanisms or structures that produce events, or of imagining the specificity of a particular time and place, not to mention the training in languages and the training in archival research and the other things that the historians are so good at. So historical sociology of the sort that I'm promoting would really try to combine both. Of course, that's a more ambitious program for training graduate students and for doing research, but so be it. It at least gives us a goal to strive for, even if we can't always attain it.
It sounds to me that you're also saying that we need to fold philosophy into that mix as well. Sociological theory, history, and philosophy appropriately construed.
Yes, I think philosophy is completely part of that mix because of the relative autonomy of discourses, of theoretical discourse that I've described earlier. I disagree with those colleagues of mine who think that theory should always, in sociology, be combined with empirical research. I think there should be space, as there is, say, in the discipline of political science, for a relatively autonomous elaboration of political theory in that case, and social theory in the case of sociology. And social theory has a natural affiliation to philosophy, or at least to certain branches of philosophy that are concerned with the same objects of analysis. Someone like yourself, or someone like Hegel, to take another example, are concerned with many of the same processes that sociologists are concerned with, even if they're approaching them in a slightly often more abstract way. I think there are natural connections there that need to be further developed. And in fact, the discipline of sociology, when it emerged in Germany and in France, did partially come out of philosophy.
Right.
I mean, the engagement I've just been discussing of Weber with the Southwest German School of Neo-Kantians, not to mention some of the Weimar era sociologists. Some of the sociologists in the Weimar Republic were reading Heidegger, for example. There's no denying that. And in the French case, someone like Durkheim, and all the way through to Pierre Bourdieu and his generation, they were agrégés in philosophy for the most part at the École Normale Supérieure. So there was a complete influx of philosophical ideas to the discipline. The United States, of course, has never had that same philosophical feeder current into sociology as a recruitment current or background, but I think that remains to be constructed, or the connections in some way need to be reconstructed.